This guy legitimately got one of the rarest items in the game. At 70,000 subscribers, I will do a cooking stream. So if you want to see that, subscribe. So in my last video, I talked about a bunch of the dyes that were added into skyblock after one of the recent updates. And a bunch of these dyes are extremely rare, and I said that no one has obtained them. Well, only a few days since I released that video, someone actually obtained one of these dyes. I definitely recommend watching that video if you want to learn more about this, but sadly he didn't drop any of the really rare dyes like the Celadon dye, but he did drop a pretty rare one known as the aquamarine dye. The aquamarine dye is extremely rare and has a 1 in 15 million chance to catch while fishing. And luckily this time I can actually prove that this dye exists. But before that, I'll be announcing that I have an essentials cosmetic. If you play skyblock on Forge, it's almost guaranteed you have essentials. And now you can buy my Baby Yeti cosmetic from the store. Remember to use code MASHCLASH at checkout, and let's get right into the video. Okay, so if you look in my hand, I legit have the aquamarine dye with me right now, which, as I said, is an extremely rare item. So you can see beside me, Dono, who's actually the guy who owns the dye right now. But he's not actually the guy who actually dropped it. The guy who actually dropped it is who I'll be talking about next. So the player who actually dropped it was Solgaleo66. Sadly for Solgaleo, he got a little bit too excited once he dropped it, and he sold it to Dono for only 250 million coins. With all of the demand and people knowing how rare this item is, I definitely think he could have sold it for way more. But obviously for Dono, this is a huge win. Another positive, I guess you could say, is that Solgaleo66 isn't just a random non that got a super expensive item after like barely playing the game. He actually played it a decent amount, but not that much. His skill average is 31.94, which is decent, but in terms of fishing, he's only fishing level 25, and he's only actually killed 3,516 sea creatures. To put that into perspective, that means he hasn't even dropped the epic dolphin pet yet. If you watched the last video, you would have known that someone actually said that they dropped one of these fishing dyes, which in that case was the iceberg dye. But thanks to this guy actually dropping the aquamarine dye, we actually see the real message that you get when you catch one. And we can see that it's completely different from the one in that previous screenshot. So it basically confirms that that guy was lying. In my last video about these dyes, I gave an approximate number of hours it would take to acquire each of them. And the one I gave to aquamarine dye was 19,230 hours. In skyblock, you have a chance of either catching a sea creature or you catch treasure, or just a normal fish. The confusion lies in whether a dye falls into the loot table of a treasure, or if it is completely separate to both treasure and sea creature. If it lies in its own loot table, it's a pretty easy calculation. All we have to do is calculate the average time it takes for someone to cast their rod and fish something up, and then just multiply that by 15 million, cause theoretically, if you catch 15 million things, you should get at least one dye. I used this assumption when I calculated that it would take 19,000 hours to get one. However, if you consider the scenario where the dye is a part of the fishing or treasure loot table, then this makes it a lot harder to calculate. Or so I thought. You can actually have a maxed fishing speed and the base 20 sea creature chance. This effectively means that in both scenarios, the length it will take will be the same, except that it will take 25% longer in the second scenario, because 1 out of 5 catches will actually be a sea creature. Like I said earlier, the test I used to calculate how long it would take me to get an aquamarine dye wasn't the best. So now, thanks to the wiki, I can actually use math to get a way better value. So the first value we need to calculate to find out the time per cast is the base value. So you should be able to see the formula, which is right here, which says 400 minus 10 times the lure enchantment level. This is quite easy to calculate because the max lure enchantment level you can have is 6. So what we do is 400 minus 10 times 6, which is obviously 340. So now we need the base ticks value. So the base ticks value actually ranges from 200 to the base value that we just calculated. So that means this base tick value can be anywhere from 200 to 340. Since this value is random, I'll actually find out how long it takes on the low end and how long it takes on the high end, and then take the average of that value. Now for the big step, we have to calculate the base tick's final value. You can see the formula on the screen, and basically what you have to do is take that previous base tick value and then multiply it by a bait multiplier, a talisman multiplier, a pets multiplier, and then a rods multiplier. So in our case, our final base ticks calculation will be 200 or 340 times 0.7 for the fish bait, times 0.95 for the fish affinity talisman, times 0.6 for the flying fish pet, and finally times 0.25 for the rod of the sea or shredder. This gives us a final base ticks value of 19.95 on the low end and 33.915 on the high end. These values are then rounded to the nearest whole number and then divided by 20, and that will give us the amount of seconds it will take for us to fish up an item or a sea creature. This means if you have a fully maxed fishing setup, the longest it can take for you to catch a fish is 1.7 seconds, and the shortest it will take is 1 second. So on average, each cast will be about 1.35 seconds. Now, to get the total time it would take to grind, all we have to do is take this 1.35 and multiply it by 15 million. And this gives us 20,250,000 seconds, which is equal to 5,625 hours or 234 days of straight grinding for this. Sadly, this means my calculation was a little far off, but otherwise this is still extremely rare. To put this into perspective, I have been playing the game since it has been released, and I don't even have 5,000 hours played. This isn't even considering the fact that you have to have perfect reaction time on every fishing cast for this long. So it's safe to say nobody's gonna grind for this item, at least not intentionally. Yeah, so that about does it for this video. See you in the next one.
Pharmacy. Woo!